Welcome. I'm Valerie Fletcher. I'm the Executive Director of the Institute for Human-Centered Design, and we are thrilled to have a group of people today to introduce a conversation. We can only go so far in an initial conversation, but this is something that we think is absolutely central to our mission and to the mission of any designer with a conscience. So we are going to be hosting a group of 5 designers. You have their bios both in synopsis, in the constant contact, and their full bios on our website. So I'm not going to take time to introduce them. They will quickly make it clear their expertise. I want you to be aware that IHCD is deeply invested in this moment as an opportunity to catalyze change. We are also assisted in our perspective by a simultaneous project called The Changing Reality of Disability in America 2020, which will tell you the story when it is released to the public in 3 weeks fully. And there is a short documentary on our website today. But it essentially tells the story of inequity in America and racism in America as catalysts for a rising proportion of our population of adults and children with disabilities. And we want to talk about this topic as a way, this topic of the role of design, the role of designers and of inclusive design as a means to take action. And this is a group that is all about taking action. We want to remind you who, many of you know us and know our particular framework, that disability is contextual. Functional limitation is a universal fact of human life, but it is disabling at the context between the individual and their environments. Designers are makers of environments, and thus we feel a particular responsibility to take action now and to minimize the limitations and to maximize people's opportunity to fully participate. The other thing I want you to know is that we are deeply committed around participation. We know that these problems are huge. They will not be solved by designers alone, except in participatory process with the people we are designing for. And lastly, I just want to make it clear that we are talking Black Lives Matter, but in all of the Black Lives Matters conversations, we are talking about Black, Indigenous, and people of color. So don't imagine that we are not thinking a little more expansively. So I will now get off the screen and defer to our moderator, who will introduce our panelists. And that is Ricardo Gomez, who is a longtime member of our board of directors and a very long-time friend of the organization. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you, Valerie. Good morning and welcome to our discussion today for the Institute's Lunch and Learn, Black Lives Matters to Reframing Inclusive Design. And I just wanted to make a few opening comments to follow up on what Valerie has shared with us. And some of those comments are really touching on some of the topics we hope to share with you today. And we're just going to kind of review some of them based on, we have 4 topics we're literally framing, and I've had a chance to try to be somewhat metaphorical about the literally reframing. And by reframing, we're talking about the existing frame that happened prior to COVID-19 and the raising the awareness and the disparity that's brought to the forefront, particularly how it impacts African-American, Black, and Latino, Brown, and other people of color, and others who may be disenfranchised in the low-income community area. And in that regard, we have 4 topics we're going to be covering. One is going to be education in history. So I want to start, as myself being an educator, on that topic and how it impacts us when we begin to sow the seeds of how we create this reframing or even changing the paradigm that in which we're currently existing within. And Brad Grant, who is a professor at Howard University in the College of Architecture and Engineering, will lead that discussion. We'll follow with the second side of the frame, if you will, which will be based on practice in the built environment. And we're going to be having June Grant, who is an architect coming out of the Oakland Bay Area with a company, Blink ! Lab. And we also have Nigel Jacob, who will also be touching on the matter, who's also working on the area of urban futures and investment and services, which will be one of the other topics we'll cover. The third topic will be communication, led by Nikeisha Nelson, who is a senior visual designer out of Frog Design in New York. And then again, we'll conclude with the environment, urban future investments and service. And I want to touch on just quickly why we chose those four topics related to literally a frame, the four sides of framing, how we're really going to have to maybe dismantle or reframe that topic. In doing so, we'll be looking at reframing the individual in the society. We'll be pivoting away from individual disabilities in the societal environmental as a catalyst. And then we'll look at Black Lives Matter's exclusion from the frame and needing to include that in the reframe. And we'll also be looking at the environment as a primary catalyst for disability and access limitation. And finally, disability is only allowed to be in the manner in which the environment is the producer of that disability. So we'll touch on areas of education, visual communication, the built environment, policy, and how we can create change. So with that in mind, I want to start with Brad Grant, if we can, to introduce how he looks at addressing the issues of the education in history. And Brad, if you would like to take the platform relative to our topic on education and history. Brad Grant.
Thank you, Ricardo, and welcome. I'm honored to be part of this presentation. I've always felt and thought that education, the educational aspect of this discussion is really the heart of it, because a lot of our attitudes, a lot of our design sensibilities will really spring from our education. And if the educational environment and the education that we receive does not include or does not center this idea of justice in design, then there's a great chance that we may not face that as we proceed into our professional life. Now, you know, there's been a lot of, in fact, I've always suggested that the high point of kind of centering environmental and racial justice in design really sprung in the 60s in our higher educational institutions. There were great disruptions and rallies and such in Columbia, at Berkeley, and many of these institutions, not specifically about design, but it's specifically about social justice. But importantly, in the 80s, I like to cite as a historical reference, Ray Lifshay. I happen to have worked and learned under Ray Lifshay, a professor at University of California, Berkeley, who really started talking about integrating the idea of client collaborations and design studios, and especially clients with disabilities to impact the design studios. And Ray Lifshay was noted for that and spread that theory around. That was a high point. Then it kind of coupled in with what was happening in the political movements with obviously with the advancement of the legislation of the ADA in the 90s. And in the 90s in higher educational institution, I would venture to say spurred by the legislation of the ADA, many of the educational institutions kind of picked up on the legislative aspect of inclusive design based on the AIA. And this brings into the point where the accreditation agencies, at least in architectural education, the National Architectural Accrediting Board, started to impose that to be an accredited school of architecture, you had to, one, be more diverse. You have to teach more than just the Western canon, architectural Western canons, and you had to demonstrate at least some instructions with the ADA. And again, that was very limited but this started to enter the design studios and the design field. But having said that, and having given my version of the brief history of that, it's woefully lacking this idea of centering environmental justice, social justice, and certainly racial justice centered into the design program or into the design pedagogy. It has been, still is at the margins. So you do have professors and other classes that will speak to this idea of centering and including these issues of social and racial justice, but more at the marginal area. And then I think one of the things that we do need to do to really start to focus on this is to acknowledge and highlight the role that higher education has had in oppressing and teaching the oppressive teaching of environmental design and environmental design activities. What role has higher education had, and we need to acknowledge that in limiting our understanding of many of these issues. Many institutions are doing that today, and many higher education institutions are owning up to their oppressive history. I know that Brown University and several other universities in the Ivy Leagues are really citing that, and I think that's important that we advocate and advance that. The other areas that I think has not happened that we need to push for happening is bringing back Ray Lip's idea of integrating and collaborating with clients as the basis of our design studio projects. Instead of having hypothetical clients and so on, bring in real people into the studio, people of all diverse and backgrounds, by the way. Ray was very good at that. He would bring in people with various backgrounds and abilities and such, and we need to revert back to that. Again, the accreditation agency, although they're tiptoeing to that direction of mandating schools of architecture to have more interdisciplinary and collaborative type of teaching, they haven't really struck a strong chord with that. And when we look at the educational institutions, more and more of our students are with disabilities. We're having more and more students, generally and certainly in architecture schools, with disabilities, mainly cognitive disabilities and such, but there is really rising. And when you talk to the counseling centers and career centers, they can confirm those kinds of issues that we need to really take a strong look at. And lastly, there's this issue of diversity. How do we make our educational environment more diverse, both representationally diverse, more people of color, students of color, faculty of color, as well as more theoretically diverse. Again, moving beyond the Western canon and educating students of architecture. And with that, we enter this idea, and I'm just going to cite it of the international community, or the international student body, faculty body, claiming to be a way to make our institutions more diverse and so on, and pit it with domestic diversity versus international diversity. We can get more into that as we get to the questions and answers, but that becomes a big issue as a way of hedging, perhaps, and tackling the real issues of bringing in people of all backgrounds, addressing this idea of Black Lives Matter and social and racial and environmental injustice. I think I'm going to kind of back off there and hope that there's more questions and comments that we can comment on.
Sure. Thank you, Brad.
The educational institutions.
Thank you, Brad. I just wanted to we have about 5 minutes. Actually, we've still got a little bit more time to discuss this issue, and I may follow that up with some Q&A, but I wanted to follow up with your discussion, particularly about education and where education, we can look at it, how we can consolidate and heighten the sense of commitment to each other in addressing systemic racism relative to inclusive design, practice, and education. Where do we begin? And I wanted to just take the opportunity in celebration of the 30th anniversary of the ADA and the disability rights movement by citing the fact that you mentioned Ray Lifshay over at Berkeley, and where obviously Berkeley was really kind of the center, the point of really this civil rights amendment, the movement, if you will, in terms of the disability movement, and people coming out of Berkeley, as yourself as a student, and Ray Lifshay, and even with Miss Human and all of the movements coming out of that area. But I also wanted to raise the account of other institutions that have also been at the forefront historically, and we can go back to Mark Harrison at RISD, at Rhode Island School of Design, and the work he was doing as a product designer, industrial designer, in dealing with issues of universal design, and had a very well-known project in redesigning the kitchen, in dealing with the home environment, and that expansion. And then we can move on to obviously Ron Mace and his movement in being one of the premier authors with the collective of writers and authors that formulated the universal design principles back in 91, following the ADA's implementation in 1990. And that was at North Carolina State University in the Center for Universal Design. And there were a number of other centers you had in Georgia Tech with John Sanford doing significant work there, even working in conjunction with the VA, particularly in relative to veterans and so forth. So we can look at where are the avenues, or where are the pathways where education can begin to sow the seeds of reconstructing the frame, the reframing that we're addressing today. And we can even go back to...
Ricardo, and I would like to also add, and I think it's important to note that the precursor to the Institute for Human-Centered Design, Adaptive Environments, made a great effort again, around that same period that we're speaking about, made a great effort with the Universal Design Education Project, where they really kind of floated these proposals, RFPs and proposals to many of the schools of architecture around the country. In fact, you and I were part of that effort to really instill this idea of centering issues of design and equity and diversity within the schools of architecture. So I think that's important. We also should mention Buffalo, University of Buffalo as part of that.
Thank you. I was about just to mention that before you came in with your additional comments, and certainly with Ed Steinfeld and the SUNY Buffalo crew, and some of the significant they were doing around the IDEA Center, and even Greg Vanderheijn over at the University, I believe it was Wisconsin. So yes, we had some really premier institutes, you know, from Berkeley across to RISD, and up and down from Buffalo down to North Carolina and Georgia Tech. And so how do we begin to, again, expand on this? And I'm glad you brought up the adaptive environments, because that's where my beginning started at Massachusetts College of Art. And again, I'm still very proud having met Elaine Ostroff back in 1978 when the adaptive environments was formulated in the studio at Massachusetts College of Art. And that was my beginning with them. And I'm always proud to say that I believe I was there right at the beginning with adaptive environments, and transitioning with Valerie Fletcher at the Institute and being part of the board now. So I'm very proud and honored to be part of that history and evolution. But I believe now, again, with the advent of COVID-19, it's really brought into the forefront those of us who have historically been disenfranchised, but yet have always been dismissed in terms of some of the statistical data I was sharing with Valerie, looking at NPR and PBS coverage they've been doing this week in commemoration of the anniversary, the 30th anniversary, and those who are at the forefront. And when we deal with Black Lives Matter, we have to remember the Black Panthers were very much significant in supporting the occupation of the federal building back in San Francisco, and then even supported members of the Black Panthers and members of the parties coming from Berkeley over to Washington. They were putting forth the petitioning for the ADA and literally walking up the steps of the, or moving up the steps of the Capitol building. So clearly, Black Lives Matter is not a new avenue, but really we're looking at riding this momentum. Yes, Brad.
And let's not forget in this special time, and I'm reminded of the late John Lewis, who just passed, and his advocacy of these issues. And I would like our audience to know John Lewis, although he's rich in the history of social justice and civil rights and so on, he was the instrumental congressperson that helped establish the new Smithsonian Museum of African American History and Culture. Congress, the national planning organizations did not want that building to be placed where it is. And if it wasn't for John Lewis and his authority and his background, that building may not have been placed where it is. So there's a rich history, but I think, Ricardo, as we're talking about this rich and active history, and we could cite all these people, when we look today, not much has changed or has happened. Again, all these wonderful institutes and centers that we have cited have often and always been marginalized. They haven't been centered. My point is that when and how do we center these issues in the design education and not put them to the margins or put them to the edges, and that's the placement that I would like to emphasize as we close.
But this is a wonderful segue to our Q&A, because we're right at that point where we'd like to get into Q&A for at least the 5 minutes. I have 2 questions that have come through, and I'm going to go on one that's directly commenting to you, Brad. This is a comment on following up on Grant's observation of the influence of ADA and university accreditation. How do national standards and best practices affect our thinking about inclusive design? If these standards and practices need to be revised, where do we start? Do you have any thoughts on that, Brad?
Yeah, I do have some thoughts, and certainly please our other guests, if you have thoughts, because we're talking about education doesn't mean that the others, but my initial thoughts is that, again, the ADA really in the educational sector and for accreditation sector really talks about the technical specifications, right? Make sure that the students understand some of the dimensional requirements and the technical requirements. And what is much needed is, 1, the policy implications of that, and 2, just the human-centered implications of that. And I liken this to this understanding of the others, right? We all think of design based on who we know and what we know, and oftentimes don't base the wide and broad nature of design on the other. The other could be different ethnic groups, different racial groups, certainly different groups of abilities. And that's where it needs to be centered, not so much on the technical responses. We know we can clearly determine the correct dimensions and so on, but what is the whole experience based on the others? And I think in architecture schools and programs need to start at that basis.
Yeah. Let me, I'm going to address one more question, and I think we're going to transition to our next topic and lead discussion person. This is going to be practice in the built environment with June Grant, but I think you mentioned, are there any other participants within our panel to speak? And I'd like perhaps maybe if June can maybe transition this as a practicing architect as well. But I have one comment that was asked about making note that interior design programs were part of this program as well. And I certainly do not want to dismiss them because they have been clearly at the forefront. And I want to go back and reiterate that Mark Harrison, the late Mark Harrison at RISD, led that charge, even though it was kind of industrial design led. It was clearly dealing with the kitchen and the whole interior space of functionality, because as many of you know, the two primary environments that sustain independent living in our built environment and household is the kitchen and the bathroom, because that's where we provide the services that we need to coexist and live in an efficient and healthy aspect of well-being. So clearly interior design has been a program, and I just want to add my work with adaptive environments back in 1978, where at the time I graduated as the first African-American with a degree in industrial design from Massachusetts College of Art back in 79 and 80. And my thesis project at the time, and using the language of that day, was I designed an adaptive structural environment for handicapped children and mentally retarded children. That was the language of the day. And that was assisted with adaptive environments and Elaine Ostroff. So clearly, that was well over 40 years ago. And we're clearly looking at those people who are really impacted. And obviously there is a disproportionate amount of people of African-American, Black, and Brown people who are highly impacted by the adversity of the built environment, from environmental racism to inadequate health care and wealth care. So with that in mind, I'm going to shift to our next topic. June Grant, if you would like to carry forward. And again, we're talking now on the second side of the frame to the notion of the practice in the built environment. And I know there's a number of issues that June may like to share with us, from shifting the mindset for individual accommodation of ADA, social observations, accountability, opportunities embedded in multi-generational perspectives, spatial shifts in the inclusive design space, and how we deal with issues of even public transportation. So June, would you like to carry forward the subject, please? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ricardo. Can you hear me fine? I noticed that Valerie was attempting to get your attention earlier. Valerie, are you okay? You had a question. I think she was responding to something Brad said.
Valerie, would you like to segue a comment?
Thank you, June. I just wanted to make sure that we acknowledge that interior designers, interior architects have been consistent with the people that Brad's talking, that Ricardo was referencing, are in many cases people who were the leaders 20 and more years ago. Interior designers have really been champions right through when it has been tough to get the attention of a lot of schools of architecture. So I just wanted to make sure that we acknowledged that leadership. So thanks, June. Appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, and that was actually great, because I wanna piggyback on Brad's comment about education, and I'll just reference it back to my own experiences and surprise while in grad school at Yale School of Architecture back in 96 through 99. And what really shocked me was actually how little attention was paid to the observation of how life is actually lived, and how much attention was paid to canons that were hundreds of years old, which had practically no relationship to how we're living today. And even I have a little problem with the words best practice, because the words best practice allow you to be lazy. And what you end up doing is taking someone else's experience and ideas and just simply applying it. And so we end up with kind of a lazy attitude, which is what the ADA resulted in, where we had a codification of ideas around how we want to include the needs of the disabled. And what resulted in was almost like an established ceiling as to what should be accommodated, i.e. easy access into a building, how high light switches should be. But actually, what designers ended up doing was being less observational and more just applying a checklist. And I think part of education, at least at the architecture school, needs to start to pivot back to the role of observation of life as lived and the role of observation of new technologies as they're being applied today, and less reliance on the canons. The reliance on the canons have resulted in quite, I find it very lazy how we've been approaching design. And so I want to point how that impact of that lazy attitude and on the application of the ADA laws has resulted in the most boring of housing experiences. And I point to housing in particular because it's the one way we're able to see how we're designing for not just shelter, but we've forgotten that housing is actually a place where you're supposed to call home. And the design of housing, if you apply the ADA, only applies to multi-unit structures. And the result is what we've done is create an environment where the design of multi-unit structures relegates the needs of the disabled as a segregated other. And so you may go into a multi-unit building and there are only a designated number of units that are specifically for individuals with, say, wheelchair accommodation and being able to roll into a shower. But I'll compare that to another housing structure that I lived in personally in Austria, where all units had floor level showers where you could roll in. So there were no designated handicap units. All units were accessible to anyone with impairments. And so this attitude within the US has a very segregationist approach where we must design something special for, i.e. people with disabilities, which do not recognize that we go through times when we are temporarily disabled. I might have had an accident that required that I need to use crutches. How do I get about? That's a form of disability. It's temporary, but it's my experience in life. And so what we do need to do is hark back to what we're teaching in schools about the role of observation, the roles of observing how we live, and start to apply that to the bigger design question, particularly around housing. And then I want to push that even further by looking at the laws and city governance. And what we have allowed in, and let's use the example of, say, accessory dwelling units today. What we see are laws being proposed by the state, which are meant to be blanket. But we do know that the blanket has been the tyranny of the majority. That what happens with blanket laws, if you don't identify the most vulnerable in the community, they are left out in the solution. And then what happens is we assume at the city level that the city will create ordinances which will be specific to the local context, of which all the city does, and to give an example, Oakland or San Jose, all the city does is replicate what the state has done. There is no attempt to fine-tune blanket laws and ordinances to make them applicable to the most vulnerable of our communities. And so what we end up doing is replicating past discriminatory practices. What we end up doing is replicating segregated communities. So let me go back to the ADU ordinance. For example, if Oakland says, okay, in applying the state law, we would like to center the needs of the most vulnerable. And the Oakland ordinance will say, we will give preference to projects which address the needs of the disabled community. We will give preference to projects which are geared towards those who need financial stability the most, the ones are closest to being homeless. We will center the needs of our older population because those are the ones that are most likely to experience very expensive health financial implications, which will force them to sell their homes and will probably end up being on the streets. By taking that preventative, we will center the needs of our most vulnerable in our ordinances. We start to raise the floor. Instead, what we have are planning policies, which again just are meant to be blanket and act as a trickle-down theory that who will address the most vulnerable are nonprofit organizations that may be developers, nonprofit developers. We relegate the provision of social services to special organizations. But I actually think our planning departments have a bigger role to play. They should be more inclusive in their mindset, inclusive in their policies. But that inclusion means you actually center the needs of the most vulnerable in the creation of your policies. And that forces, example, banks to create the projects and the programs and the financial tools which will be applied to those needed projects. But by not centering and not being participatory and not being inclusive in our policies, but having these tyranny of the majority blanket policies, all banks do is respond to the policies that have been put in place. And so they have loan agreements or loan products, which are far more applicable to those who are financially stable and don't respond to the need of financial instruments that solve some of our most dire housing needs. We really need to broaden how planners, how our planning departments, our government agencies are organized so that they pivot away from this idea that they're only there to provide the needs of a large private developer and start to recognize that their role is to govern for the entire population and their nuances within that population. There are nuances in how we need to look at the urban environment itself. And then I want to wrap up my final point about moving from just policy of housing to now understanding how we look at the urban environment and how that is governed. And I want to give an example of the BRT, the bus rapid transit line, which was approved to go down International Boulevard. And what that line did or is doing, it ripped through a historically Black community, destroyed already fragile Black businesses, and put a bus line down the center of the road, of which, if you are disabled, you are walking on the sidewalk, which is at the far extreme right or extreme left. You walk down the sidewalk, you get to the intersection, you must cross traffic, i.e. cars, to get to the bus rapid transit stop, which is in the dead center of the road, to board a bus. If you're in a wheelchair, your head is at the height of the bonnet. I'm English, so what do you call it again? The front of the car, the engine. Your head is at the front of the person in the car cannot see you in a wheelchair unless you have a flagpole sticking out of your wheelchair. We have designed something coming down International Boulevard that in itself is discriminatory in its design. Why we didn't instead adopt our sidewalks to meet the needs of the bus is beyond me. But it thought, the transit department thought it was easier to get the buses by creating bus rapid transit line. But what they did was increase the vulnerability of the disabled community because they must pass through rapid traffic to get to the bus. That in itself should never have happened. If we were thinking inclusively, our transportation systems would take into consideration the most vulnerable of how we get to that bus and not design a system that actually increased our vulnerability. And then I want to end by a theory I have, which is we're designing our cities and policies the way we are today because our planning departments are simply not located in our communities. Instead, what we have done is lump the thinking tanks, the downtown as the core. I call it almost an addiction. We have been centering downtown and economics as our basis for planning. As a result, our communities are left without amenities that they need. And so my suggestion is we need to actually break up our planning departments. We need to break up our government and start really creating a spoken wheel approach where we have satellite governing offices. And what COVID has revealed to me is that we actually don't need downtown as much as we thought we did. And so now we can start to push those amenities back into communities where we may have a local planning office, where we may have more, again, post offices, where we will have banks because we now have commerce taking place in communities. Last Sunday, the New York Times had an article, a beautiful illustration through graphics, how Manhattan has not recovered, but how recovering is occurring in the smaller communities because the communities didn't suffer as much as the downtown. And so economics is taking place in smaller communities. We have to take the message from COVID and see how it's playing out in smaller communities, that smaller communities are reviving themselves. And it's indicating that with digital tools, we can start to dismantle government agencies that have been these bureaucracies that are behemoth and centrally located and start to segregate them and actually dismantle them, fracture them, put them in the communities where the communities need those services. So I've kind of given an arc about the lived environment and policy, but also we need to start to break up where policy is being created, which is our governing offices, and start to break them up and put them in the communities so that our government agencies can begin to observe how communities are living and start policies that reflect how we live, not based on a canon or some latest idea about bicycles. I'll get off my.
Okay, no, that's wonderful. And I wanted to just try to review some of the points that you brought up, some of the pain points and even some of the greater touch points that can be part of the reframing or the restructuring. And I want to start by looking at the notion, again, as an educator, this is something that I always address with my students, particularly about trying to embrace the empathy and the reality of the disparity that we're addressing today. And even though, our focus is really looking at it in terms of Black Lives Matters and the BIPOC community and those who have been disenfranchised or underrepresented in our built environment, and that includes policy and practice. But the notion of designing across the lifespan, that when you embrace identifying and raising an awareness for the need to reframe inclusive design, and that it's not about the fact that we all encounter some aspects of disability in our lifetime, mm-hmm. and whether it be temporary or whether it be as an aspect of the deterioration of our healthcare services or even our environmental services, and from the again, we talked earlier about the environmental racism and the other people who fall victim to that, particularly when we talk about the remapping and the type of urban renewal. We know what the tragedy of urban renewal meant for many Black and brown and urban low-income people when highways literally went through the heart of many of our communities. And that goes all the way from Rhode Island to Santa Monica. I remember moving from Boston to Santa Monica to do my graduate work at UCLA, and I was always mystified, why were there some Black people on one side of the freeway and why were some on the other side? Yep. And then someone shared with me the history of Santa Monica, and it sort of seems the same thing with the history of Venice Beach. Very few people realize that Venice Beach is one of the few places in America where Black people, African Americans, lived on the beach. When I first moved to Los Angeles in 1981, I was really amazed at all the African American community that was on the beachfront, Venice Beach, which rapidly changed with the gentrification and the whole reframing of that. And we see that peril in everywhere today. And again, coming
Absolutely.
San Francisco and the Bay Area, as you can well attest, when I came to San Francisco, the African-American population was about 14%. Today, it's basically bordering under 4% in terms of that decline. And we realize that very much our African-American brown communities and low-income communities are now being basically removed economically and physically from the urban sector. And it will begin to look very much how poverty looks in Europe. When you look at Paris and all the banlieues, I was in Paris for a year and realized that all the poor people from, the blacks, the Arabs, everybody else was in the suburbs. And the suburbs were not a luxury, but really almost an expulsion.
And it's by design.
By design,
because because the policies were never started from the position of inclusion and the position of the kind, well, it might have been the kind of society that they intended was that it would be segregated. But if here we are, 2020, and we're talking about inclusion, and in order to reframe, we have to, use these examples where segregated policies resulted in, and they might not have said it was segregated in the writing of the policy, but the implementing of the policy resulted in segregation, which resulted in less amenities, which we know that these disparities in the environment actually increase disabilities throughout your lifetime. And now we have the stats as recently revealed by the community by the CDC. So we have to look at how were these policies written in the first place, and less about how are we going to implement it and be inclusive in the implementation. We cannot rely on the implementation to solve for these disparities. We actually have to start from who the heck was at the table writing the policy in the first place.
Well, let's also go back to a few things that you also brought up, and there was also a question originally that was on the panel, on the docket here, but it was removed. But when we talk about how do we best enhance home and shelter in place relative to equity and inclusion, and as we know, and this disparity is just on the news this morning when we talk about children who are going back to school, or the fact that people who are wealthy enough or privileged enough can now create these pods for their children. And we don't have that opportunity. When I say we, from the Black Lives Matters perspective, or from the BIPOC communities or the low-income communities, don't have that privilege, don't have that type of flexibility or opportunity. And when we look at shelter in place, for many of us, we don't have a built environment in terms of a home or a shelter that is equitable or is inclusive. And again, if you are
absolutely
an environment that is already depriving you of health and access and growth and development, you can imagine the greater disparity or the real if you want to call insult to injury of those people who already were deprived. And shelter in place is not a refuge. So how do we begin to try to consolidate those aspects? And let's not even go into the homeless navigation centers where those who don't even have a home to shelter, and what percentage of the homeless are disabled, what percentage of the homeless are people of color, and so again, you deal with this disparity. And Valerie and I were talking about this the other night, and I was raising the question that, well, 35% of persons with disabilities are unemployed. And then Valerie shared with me, well, also those who are African-American, 75% of people that are African-American with disabilities are unemployed. So again, we see that great disparity.
And I want to touch on that, because this will also go towards Nikeisha. When we start to, in the past, and we've been using, I know Justin is on list of participants, so he'll probably nag me later. But in my view, how we've been looking at cities is based on some 19th century model, ignoring the fact that the internet has been here for some time. What COVID has shown us is, and many have been saying this, that the internet and digital access has to be considered a utility, not a luxury. What COVID has shown us is that we have to accept that digital access needs to be built into every structure just as much as we attach electricity and water. That we have, because without that understanding, that digital access and the ability to communicate wherever you are is actually how we live today. We have been looking at it as a luxury item where you can swipe the screen, but actually now we're recognizing that no, we need it to teach kids. We're going to be, we don't know how long we're going to be home. And the sooner we grapple that this actually needs to be an infrastructure that's built into every building, the sooner we'll be able to address the yawning education gap that's going to happen. But I do have some hope. I do know of these amazing millennials, all African-American, who have gotten together and they're just ignoring professionals and saying, we're going to do this. They have galvanized themselves and created their own micro solar grid. And they're, every time I mention something about environmental tools, they're ahead of me. They're looking at me going, we got this. So the internet access, we even have discussions about trenchless internet tools, where we're looking at microgrids, where they're able to connect the homes wherever they are so that they can have access to the internet. I think we tend to, and I think academia spreads this message, that we have to, the information, the solution descends from above, from some professional person who works in a corporation. Meanwhile, there are grassroots groups that have gotten together, are aware of where they want to go, and are taking the relevant action. And we have to include them in this conversation about how we're going to bridge that gap.
I wanted you to hold on that thought, and I want to share this transition again with Nikeisha, because you're touching on communication, and it's a great opening and segue for Nikeisha. So Nikeisha, I just want you to hold on to some of those thoughts that June has, and perhaps you can transition that into the lead for your discussion. But before we do that, I do want to touch on at least 2 or 3 questions here. We have one person that's saying, June, thank you for your wisdom. What have you found? What have you found that works well within your local community and politics for lay people, AKA non-designers, non-architects, people with perhaps less access to making structural changes within design offices or law-making firms to advocate these changes in approach to design? So what do you recommend for lay persons in that regard?
Thanks, Lauren. I think I know who this is. I'll give an example of this amazing young woman I know, Marquita Price. Marquita started studying urban design and dropped out of college because the class, as it was being taught, she was anxious to implement some of the information she was learning in college. Also, many of what she was being taught in college had nothing to do with her environment in Deep East Oakland. What she did was actually reach out to various governing agencies, and I'll give one test case of a creek that runs through her neighborhood. She reached out to the Water Commission, EDMUD, and she asked them to come to the table to have a conversation about how to address the creek. Notice I haven't used the word creek design. I haven't used the word community development. I think these are third rail terms. I really try to not use the words design and development when talking to communities. But what I do is focus on the issue. Is the issue stormwater backflow? Let's talk to the organization that's in charge of keeping the stormwater clean. Let's come together at the table. I advocate for those individuals in the community who seem to be able to, who have the trust of the community. They lead the conversation. I'm usually in the background, like the second tier or third seat. And I really, I advocate for that. I support Marquita and others as they express their concerns in their community. And they typically know what the solution is or have an idea what that solution is. And all I do is I provide the background professional. I might have keywords, or I might reference them to go to a particular resource to get what they need. Or I might actually facilitate an email introduction saying, my name is June Grant. I'm an architect that works with this community. I would like you to release XYZ drawings to this person. And so I support the community effort. So that's what I really have found to be useful, because there is significant distrust by the community of professionals. We have, Black and brown as well as white, have come in as salvationists. And so the community is distrusting of us. And so what I tend to do is play a secondary role until they invite me to the front seat, until they invite me to the table. I play a supportive role.
Okay. One other thought, I'm just looking at a quick note from Valerie. One other thought, and I'm not sure how much time we're going to have to answer this, but I just want to have it be a thought, and maybe we can look at this when we get to Nigel, as a kind of dealing more with the larger urban environment. But Megan has a question. What is your perspective on the creation of affordable, accessible family housing? It is my personal experience in that recent years, developers are checking off this box by building studios and one-bedroom units. This perpetuates a form of discrimination. It allows for independent living, but also assumes that individuals requiring accessible housing not have a larger family.
Megan, I'm not really sure which city you're in, but I can respond from California's perspective, because each state and each city has a different ordinance. So in California, you can build accessory dwelling units by right. And by right means you have a parcel of land, you have space, you wish to build it. And I'm simplifying it very much so. You can build. And you can build an additional unit on the back, whether it's a 1-bedroom or 2-bedroom. The reason why these studies are being shown in, say, real estate projects or real estate agents are including notes that a site is able to accommodate an accessory dwelling unit. One is we're really trying to inspire the construction of these accessible options. We do need the housing. We have way too many people living on the streets, and we have perpetuated a system of building luxury housing. So we need these affordable options. Where the discrimination comes in is not so much the advertising of the parcel being able to accommodate a unit. Where the discrimination comes in is that in writing the new policies, we didn't provide a financial tool to provide the financing for individuals to build these. And so what was left was the market should solve the problem. Well, the bank is not going to create a program for low-income folks. A bank is not going to create a program for a senior individual. A bank is not going to create a social interest ADU loan policy. That's not their job. That's not what they're in the business to do. So in order for us to flip the script, the discrimination comes from not having a financial system in place that allows us to repair the historic discriminatory practices in financing for housing. And until we actually input a public bank, or until we actually start to enforce fair financing practices, we are going to replicate that discriminatory, segregatory, only white folks will be able to build ADUs.
Okay, thank you very much, June. We're going to now flip the switch and go to the third side of our frame. And that third side of the frame is communication. And again, there were a number of thoughts that June had also shared, and I have a number of questions in here also that are concerned about the internet, particularly from rural communities, and yes, the internet as a utility and the digital divide and those kind of notions. So Nikeisha, a few things that touch on communications, and I'll just kind of run through them and then open the door for you. We're looking at technology, we're looking at mass customization of an ideal opportunity for inclusive design, we're looking at autonomy and independence, we're looking at cognitive dissonance, in regards to products, experiences with one's environment, and we're looking at bandwidth as a civil right and who's left out in virtual education, work, and healthcare. So with those kind of cursory notes framing the subject, welcome, Nikeisha, and please share with us your thoughts on Black Lives Matters to reframing inclusive design.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you. All the panelists have been wonderful so far. Firstly, I'll kind of touch on the aspect of communication, more specifically the internet and the bandwidth, as also looking at education, remote working. It's clear even before COVID that it's an integral thing that needs to be addressed within our nation and the globe at large, in terms of it being really a gateway for agency and communication to different, not only community members, but for growing one's own sort of direction within their direction of where they would like to go within their life, of growing careers, etc., building communities and friends and connections. And so that is something that throughout design that I think has to be addressed. It has to be very much shown accountability for the fact that it's something that is keeping a large gap between I remember earlier you were speaking about education and a lot of the different, say, scholarships and initiatives happening with different universities, but really at its core, if you're implementing and trying to reach out and to provide assistance and support at the level of university, you're still missing a large gap, a large population that's really coming in within education at, say, a K through 12 level, whether it's educating about design as a whole or even just providing support through that vehicle. And then again, communication being a vehicle that can be helpful for others to then provide agency through that. Something also I wanted to touch on that hasn't really been strongly addressed, I guess, but in terms of the cognitive dissonance that you mentioned, Ricardo, there's an element of psychological sort of dissonance and disconnect really that's happening within our nation and has happened because of the history of our nation. And there's a lot of stress and anxiety that's kind of compounded and as a result of that within many different sectors. And really what I'm speaking of is the disconnect between values of equality that aren't shown and exercised within our society. And so that's another layer, I think, that is really placed on people of color in general, as well as people with disabilities, BIPOC as well. And I think that's oftentimes underlooked because it's not as quantifiable in terms of even looking at the mental health within a lot of communities. But there is this layer of cognitive dissonance and psychological stress that is also added and compounded with a lot of this. And so also kind of looking through the lens of design and inclusivity, you know, looking at communication, not just from the technological standpoint, but also from the environmental, you know, viewing glass of wayfinding, public and private spaces, different onboarding, just experiences as a whole when you're in the digital realm or even in the physical world. It's really integral to have, as was spoken earlier, really on the ground and working with people so that it's a full spectrum and people of all walks of life. And obviously we're seeing the discrepancy within Black, people of color, and disability as well being left out of that equation. But this is really the world that we're living in and exercising in. And so that's another reason why it's so important. There's an element also within this sort of lived experience and also lived environment. There's I believe it's David Kirsch as well as Andy Clark and David Chalmers who look at the cognitive coupling that's kind of exercised when you're experiencing different products or just experiencing different tools really as a whole. And so as we're all working through this world, utilizing tools, it's also not really so cognizant that we have an association and a relationship with tools that we're interacting with. And if these tools themselves are not being created with us in mind, and they're not being created thinking of our nuances with our lived experience, then there's again that cognitive dissonance, that stress, that disconnect of belonging, but also functioning through our lives. And again, lack of agency kind of compounded with that. Also, I want to kind of touch on like the history aspect of this, because recently, I mean, it's funny, it's not quite recently, but it's recent in terms of its publishing because of the difficulty that was that Dr. Lisa Cook had gone through. But she's an economist, a professor of economics at Michigan State University, and did a study in a paper looking at really innovation gap, the innovation patent gap within this country, and really saw that, you know, there are some ways that economists and people are trying to spark innovation, looking at providing more funding to science labs and, you know, other types of funding and collaboration, which is lovely. But she saw that there's a huge gap in representation and really traced it back to Jim Crow era and all of those surrounding sort of laws, GI Bill, and so forth, those elements of oppression that can be linked together to really show the discrepancy of patent filings within this country by people of color. And even some of the earlier inventions that we've seen from Black people and how utilized they are within our economy and within our way of life, our society as a whole, it really opens the gap in awareness to see that there could and should have been these beautiful, wonderful inventions by a diverse array of people, but have been somewhat staunched out of our history. And she was able to give a number of more of approximately and more than 1,100 inventions that were essentially lost through this period. But when we look at it from this perspective and see that there was this kind of gap, not only of oppression that we feel now in so many different sectors, but this reverberates out into the products that we use today, and the lack of awareness in a lot of ways and inclusion that these product makers and designers have, unfortunately. And so now we're kind of given this sort of large load, but also, you know, opportunity to take this further and design ourselves into it, as well as designing, you know, others into it and having a space for us all. There are some people similarly to what June had mentioned, who are kind of taking this on in their own right. And it's not just about taking it on for your own community, but really being a voice and expanding the entryway to design for others, and listening to others, you know, integral to be able to really bring each other into the scope. The Ethels Club is a group, it's a membership club, and they're doing a lot of work centered around wellness and creativity, joy and community building. And they've kind of taken it upon themselves to try to expound this and to make it a global sort of community, of which, you know, a lot of us aren't really connected with. I'm very glad to be on this panel to be able to connect with other designers and, you know, minds that have made an impact. And so going forward, I would see that a lot of, you know, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, in terms of institutions, you know, doing scholarships and internships and different programs being lovely and wonderful, I would also really push the idea of trying to implement and interject design within the lives of young children at an early age, so they're even educated and aware that design exists and what it can do, not only for themselves, but for others, if they're able to, if they really learn the pathways of including others and in designing for others as well. So I wanted to kind of lay that there and can open it up for questions as well.
Okay. I thank you very much for sharing that. What I'm going to do, because I think we're doing very well with our time, and I wanted to touch on different axes. I had a couple of questions here relating to inclusive strategies, and particularly around the internet. So this was, again, the notion of digital access as a utility, and how we better leverage that. And again, I had an earlier person who was here that was talking, who was coming from Japan. Unfortunately, their topic is still not. Oh, here it is. Here it's a. We had a question from Nat. It said about education. Here in Japan, many universities apply Zoom lectures because of COVID-19. We found it quite useful for autism students. Thinking about the whole notion and the inequities that have been raised earlier about folks being able to work from home or shelter in place. How do you look at communication in the age of COVID-19, and particularly in terms of some of the adversity or the inequity, another level of inequity that is now surfaced, particularly when it comes to education and information, and those of us who can't take advantage of these kind of impromptu pods that are being created. You have any thoughts on that, or how in the future that may be better serviced or facilitated?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, definitely when it comes to bandwidth and, Wi-Fi internet in general, as it being something that should be a human right in a lot of, aspects. I mean, there's so many discrepancies and discrepancies are the seeds that will grow into these kind of problems and these gaps, really based within, if you don't have a strong Wi-Fi, I wouldn't be able to talk to you right now. If I didn't have a suitable environment to work in at my home, then I wouldn't be, equipped adequately compared to others who do have those things. So what we're seeing is really just an expanding, an exponential expansion of these issues and these problems kind of under the microscope of this COVID time. And so I would say that when it comes to policies and things that have been kind of touched on a little bit earlier, it's important to find ways in which, for example, the internet providers, whether it's Optimum, Verizon, et cetera, if there are ways in which that there can be plans put in place to provide low cost, and if at cost at all, sort of a Wi-Fi for communities.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to, we're going to transition shortly to the urban future. And I want to just open up to our panelists if there are, yes.
Could I add one more point to that? Sorry.
Please do, please do.
There are communities, I don't remember the name of it. Did you mention the name in Detroit, June? The ones that basically different Wi-Fi meshes that have been made for different communities as well, because the large companies themselves aren't doing what we're all speaking about right now. So that's also part of the issue. But there is agreement and understanding that it is come to the point that Wi-Fi and internet should be at this certain, human right accepted level that we all can have access to. And so that's kind of also why I'm saying that, the community level, we'll have to have it that way and to develop it on our own, because these larger organizations aren't really providing it for us. Okay, thank you.
one other, I have another question that came up. They would like to know, like to understand the cognitive dissonance in products, experiences within one's environment. Could you expand on that and how to apply?
Yeah, definitely. So first I'll take the first chunk of the dissonance being really the disconnect of your own sort of values, your own lived experience, and your own needs really being kind of compounded or conflicted with an object. Just a quick example, if I'm going to a bathroom and I want to wash my hands and it's a sensor, on the faucet, and for some reason it doesn't react to my hands. There are times where I believe through the design industry, understanding their mistakes, they've since changed this on most faucets, but there were times in which the sensor doesn't recognize darker skinned hands. And so that dissonance, that frustration, that conflict with something that I'm interacting with that has been designed for a public space and even and obviously for a private space as well. There's a lot of challenge and with that and stress and anxiety on the person themselves.
Yeah. And I'd like to just address that briefly in a broader sense, and that goes back to the notion of unconscious bias, and that's inevitable by the fact that we have lack of representation of persons with disabilities, BIPOC, and inevitably, without proper representation, you are going to continually have this type of infrastructure, this type of system, this type of frame that doesn't include us in the picture. And this is why we really need to talk about how do we reframe, look at that composition, look at that paradigm, and how do we begin to alter that? And again, it goes back to long-term investments. Anything that we may propose today, and we're just really at the scraping the surface at the tip of the iceberg at this point today, we're looking at long-term investment. I mean, there are opportunities, particularly from the perspective of Nikeisha and communication, where those type of changes are much more rapid. And there was a question on here about the existing environment and infrastructure, which is going to take longer to dismantle. And in fact, some of that dismantling may not even be possible. And I'm just going to share with you a quick example of the inequities that we are currently encountering. And I'm going to go back to history. I'm going to go back to reparations. I mean, again, the 300, 400 years of slavery and all the inequities in infrastructure that further prevented the realization of freedom or equity or inclusion is not going to happen overnight. And this is going to be coming through generations. And where do we begin that generation? It goes back to the first topic in discussion with Brad Grant about education. And even where Brad and I, academia level, it's not going to happen there. It needs to start back in elementary school, at the primary, at middle school, before we start to see where those faces and those places can start to be more inclusive by the fact of who is being represented on all levels. And that's going to require people like Google and Facebook and all the other tech giants to say that it's not about we're looking for people. It's not about build it and they will come. It's about the pathways that you create to provide the access to those pillars, those remote locations of power. And so that begins at a very early stage. So the same investment that these companies make every day to ensure their dominance or influence needs to happen retroactively, almost reverse engineering to talk about where we begin to plant those seeds and watch them sow. Valerie, do you have a point you'd like to raise?
I would just like to, before pressing it on to Nigel, I think there's something that is really important. And as challenging as imagining how do we get from where we are to where we need to get to, we have never had a better opportunity in terms of everything is broken. Right now, with COVID-19, everything is broken. I mean, I think June's very helpful emphasis on centering and the centering on downtown. Well, downtown isn't much of a story at the moment. We've never had that opportunity before. And I think we can't overemphasize what a gift it is that not only do we have everything broken and a chance to start in very new ways, but we also have a quality of diminished distraction that keeps everybody so distracted by their own work, their own lives, that nobody's really paying attention. We have a quality of attention I don't recall we've seen, at least in decades and maybe ever. So I just wanted to put it out there that those are two, however much we may be struggling, those are assets we do not wish to forfeit. Thanks.
I'd like to piggyback on that as well, Valerie, because I agree this is an amazing time in the history of mankind. And I really want to push forward this idea that the more we tend to center institutions and corporations here we are talking about inclusive dialogue. And I think we have to give credit to the individuals and the grassroots organizations that they have expertise that is valuable. They are the user experience data that should be guiding our decisions. And it takes a mindset to be willing to allow them at the table and see them as equals. This is a different mindset that we do need to cultivate.
And I think building on that, June, part of it is that we need the data from that lived expertise. And if we don't learn from that, we will not get it right. There's a quality of humility that is necessary to move ahead. Thanks.
I just want to also raise a question, and we're going to transition to Nigel. So Nigel, perhaps you can pick up on from the communication and policy to even some of the earlier discourse that June and Brad shared with us relative to where you find your expertise and knowledge best applied. I also want to just say to the general audience, we're getting some great chatter in the chat room, not as much in the Q&A. And again, if you could transfer some of that chatter to Q&A, we'd love to be able to entertain it. I'm trying to, my head's going back and forth between what's on chat and what's on Q&A. And so I'm appealing to our audience, feel free to transfer some of that chatter to the Q&A, and we're happy to entertain sharing that with our so with that in mind, I'd like to shift over to last frame in terms of the four sides of the frame that we're looking at. And in that frame, I'd like to Nigel in the notion of the urban environment in the investment in services. And services, again, is what Valerie was just alluding to in terms of everything's being broken. And is this an opportunity for us to try to have some time impact? And I think some of the points that have been raised around that, particularly since Nigel's coming from the Boston area, is Boston's innovation economy, true of most US innovation hubs, because we know of all these innovation hubs that have popped up. And it summons the attention to big problems or the wicked problems. Diversify who's at the table. How do we best diversify who's at the table? And the commitment to iterative testing of real users. And so how do we do that? And cities looking ahead, smart and inclusive cities, maybe again, dovetailing off of what Nikeisha has also enlightened us with. So Nigel, if you're there, if you'd like to take the helm and move us forward from your perspective. Thank you very much, Nigel.
Thanks very much, Ricardo. I just want to say it's really cruel having someone at the end of this conversation because I've written like 5 pages of notes, so they're absolutely useless. And so I'll do my best. But like so many of the points that have been made so far have been brilliant. I loved what June was saying around, dispersing planning departments, all of those things. So I'm going to frame what I'm going to talk about as talking about smart cities, right? And so I'll try to capture as much of that as I can in 20 minutes. So in particular, when I think about smart cities, I think there are two broad dimensions. I think that there's one dimension of technology and community. So I think that's one dimension, the way that communities interact with technology and vice versa. And then there's a dimension of governance and power. And so starting with the technology in the community notion, smart cities, just to give a quick primer for what I'm talking about, because not everyone is at the same point with this stuff. So smart cities is an effort that's grown up over the past 5 to 10, it really depends on how you define terms, right? But say 5 to 10 years in which originally it was a very corporate term. And the idea was to, we've used So corporate America suddenly realized that they've used technology to their advantage in improving, logistical flows and business process improvement and that sort of thing to such a great degree that why don't we just put those into cities, right? This is, we've been living in the century of the city for many years now, and the idea that cities and data, technology and data can make these cities better is really where this comes from, is kind of the starting point. And, originally it was big companies like IBM and Cisco, a lot of telecommunications companies started talking about that first. And that was some of the original ads that we saw. And so essentially this meant cities or big technology companies showing up with technologies that they cooked up, right? So that's the first flaw in the approach, that they just made it up in a lab somewhere, right? Right? It was largely technology made by largely white people in laboratories, nowhere near cities or on the edges of cities, not talking to the people that these technologies would be overseeing, but the idea that that these technologies would make things better. And so there's been this mad dash over the last decade to put sensors everywhere in cities, right? A lot of European cities, kind of based on the way that they're funded, they could even get a lot of money from the EU. They were able to deploy sensors everywhere, right? So Barcelona was really one of the first out of the gate. They put temperature sensors everywhere on all of the poles and all of the public realm fixtures and so on. And this proceeded for years and years. And it started out as a good unto itself, right? That we're putting technology in the built environment. How could it not be a good thing? But people began to look at these things over the past, 5 to 10 years and say, like, what is that technology actually being used for? And, it's good to know about sort of neighborhood block by block temperature differences and air quality, because obviously that impacts health and so on. But very quickly, people began to see that it was in many ways a fishing expedition, right? Let's put some technology out there and see what good it is. And so some of these technologies were used in a public safety context. There was a company, a well-known like ShotSpotter, this technology that you put it up on high on poles, street poles, and it tracks sound at street level, right? So the idea is that you hear a gunshot, and it very quickly can spin the camera over to where the gunshot and localize the gunshot, right, by triangulation of these different cameras. And yeah, there was privacy problems and considerations because you were getting faces, and it was often wrong. It often got fireworks, and naturally, these things were often deployed more in blacker and browner parts of the cities than would seem equal or equitable. But people began to, it started getting exciting, and people got, into this idea, and there's some, the technology slowly started getting better, a little more thoughtful, a little more sophisticated, until finally you had companies like Google and sort of more high-tech leading edge companies rather than, sort of behemoth companies. Not me to make fun of IBM, but and so then we ended up, just a few years ago, IBM or Google moving into Toronto, and the decision for one of the subsidiaries, Google has had this strange evolution over the years. They created this what amounts to a spinoff called Sidewalk Labs. Sidewalk Labs decided that the easiest way to bring technology into communities is to be the developer, right? Rather than just a product by product sales group, but to be the developer, right? So then they would take over large parts of a city and then use them as a playground for technologies. And so that's what we saw in Toronto. There was a piece of development happening on the waterfront called Quayside, where Sidewalk Labs had moved in to become the developer through a multi-level government deal, the local government, the provincial government, and the federal government. So it was very complicated. And right away, people were excited, right? Like, certainly the mayor was excited, right? It's great for press hits. Look at how awesome Toronto is. But very quickly, people began to fall out of love with what was going on, because they began to realize that like, if I'm a technology companies, when they put things up, the intent is to make money ultimately, right? And when we think about how these things are being used and deployed, and they made some early efforts to talk to the public, but they were really half-hearted. And I think people begin to realize that, and then there began this sort of counter movement in the community to say, this is not going well. There's all sorts of problems with the way this is happening. There's no local governance, from the bottom. Like, the communities have very little input into what's going on. And so things started going off the rails until just in the beginning of COVID, they decided to scrap the whole project. And they gave rather broad reasons as to why, but my personal analysis is because they were doing a very bad job of connecting with the community to understand what their interests are. I don't mean to throw my Sidewalk Labs friends under the bus, but they were doing things like talking about the role that technology plays in public spaces. And in this one example that I saw, a public space was a mall, right? And so in a sense, is a public space. The public certainly goes in there, but it's a wholly owned, a privately owned public space. And so those kinds of nuances were never considered as they thought about the way this technology can be used. And so, these sorts of things are being tried everywhere. They're all throughout Europe and Asia. Seoul has this huge deployment across their city. Tokyo is doing a bunch of interesting things in Singapore. I think that people really didn't ever consider the ethical implications of these technologies until very recently. And right around the time of George Floyd's death and Black Lives Matter sort of stepping into the fray to raise a fist, people began to look at the technology side of what's going on, right? So it's not just about police driving around and whatever they're doing, but it's also about the technology that are being deployed in these neighborhoods. And so, an organization that rose to prominence at the same time, which I'm really interested in now, is called Data for Black Lives by Yeshi Milner. And it was really an attempt, let's take a deeper look at the impact of technology and big data on Black and brown folk, right? And so one of the things that Data for Black Lives has looked at deeply, so big data is a major component of the smart cities narrative, right? That by having more data, the world will be better because we'll be able to detect all these different patterns and to provide solutions to ongoing problems. However, as people started looking at what these technologies were actually doing, they began to realize, oh, there were all kinds of strange things going on. These sensors are no good at detecting Black faces. They do really badly for trans people. They have problems with Black women's hair, right? And so people begin to ask harder questions about what is this, and where did it come from, and what is the impact here? And I do credit Data for Black Lives as doing a great job of digging in deeper into that. And one of their interesting narratives is to show that big data has been an oppressive force against Black and brown people for hundreds of years, not only since sensor technology has been rolled out, but ever since people kept data. Going back, right? Slavery, the slave years was in part a big data effort, right? There was massive amounts of data that are now in the Netherlands and in archives all over the world, indicating that people were keeping records about all sorts of things, about the production of farms, of agricultural products and slave farms. And so that has always been used as an oppressive force against Black and brown people going back. And so when we come back to the present day, the question of how do we deal with this issue in the modern age, where we're beginning to realize that these technologies are not neutral, right? They have an absolute preference for certain kind of power distributions and for privileging the center versus the edges or the spokes. So that means that whoever is at the center, oftentimes the city hall or local government or big corporations, they are at the center, and they are ones that are extracting value from that data. So it's like the idea of it's interesting. Like in the circles that I frequent, the idea of being extractive around communities of color is a problem. But if you go to a big data conference, you'll hear that language used all the time, extraction, because they just don't know. They just don't know. Like this is two lines of work that have not been connected. So smart cities. So that's one dimension. So there's another dimension. So I don't want to leave that on a down note to suggest that I think it's only bad news. I think there's absolutely a way to turn the tide on this trend with technology and smart cities. But I want to first talk about one other issue before I get to that, if I remember to. And I haven't even been tracking the time, but I'm the last one, so maybe that's okay. So the other dimension of this work is the question about governance, right? So smart cities suggests, even in the title, a big role for city government, right? Because city government typically controls the public right of way or the public realm to greater or lesser extent, depending on your local ordinances. And so there's absolutely a collaboration that is often happening with these technology companies and vendors and local government. And so the question is often, I mean, there are many questions there, like who has, in the dimension of governance and power, who has the power, right? And so you would presume it to be the decision maker, but in this case, what we're often seeing, what I've seen many times over the past few years, when these technologies are deployed, the communities in which they're being deployed increasingly are exerting power against what's going on or against the deployment of these tools and gadgets and sensors and so on by simply refusing to have them there, right? So, I think that along with smart cities has been this idea of local governments deploying technologies, and when communities stand up and say, what is it? What is that thing on that traffic light right there? Is it a camera? Can I get the data from that camera? Could I use that for local advocacy to improve the bike lanes that never seem to be painted well in my neighborhood? And so what's been happening is that communities are pushing back, right? They're exerting power. And so I tend to see smart cities as many things, but on the one hand, I think there's an interesting opportunity to rethink the way local governance happens, right? Because these technologies are coming, right? It's not a question of if, but when. But I think there is an opportunity here in thinking of how, right? How do they get deployed? Who makes that decision? Is it just the mayor or the chief of whatever it is at City Hall? Why can't communities make those calls, right? So I think there is an opportunity here for the power brokers or those that have power to be in dialogue with communities and to have a discussion about what these things are doing and in whose value are they operating, right? I think we have to rethink that these aren't just products that improve the way that City Hall works or the improvement of business models for these companies. I think there's this opportunity to improve the quality of these neighborhoods, assuming that we rethink, who controls the data, who has access to the data, and so on. So I do think a missing piece in the smart city dialogue is the notion of design. I had to bring it back to design. So this is it. So I think design has the power to reset the counter on a lot of these things, right? So in general, one of the faults of local government has seen or has committed in this area is to see smart cities as a series of individual products, right? And then you just buy one and then you deploy it in the community. But of course, when you deploy more than one in a given area, something else is happening, right? There's a network effect. And so I think that it becomes untenable to think about individual products. I think we need to be thinking in terms of design principles and values as applied to these technologies in communities. Are we going to privilege a surveillance state in a community? Or are we going to try to build solutions or frameworks of operation in which communities are gathering some of that data, possibly even to surveil the surveillors, what's sometimes called surveillance. And so I think that bringing inclusive design into these realms is absolutely vital if we're going to explore the potential value that can be generated by these things. So it's no longer just a question about how this big company made $1 billion in Boston. Now they move to New York and then Seattle and wherever, but rather I think there's this opportunity for us to rethink and redesign the way that these things are deployed in our communities and who has control and say over them.
Nigel, this is a great segue point for us. I think you've
I'm done.
If we can kind of transition you at that point, because you brought us back to design, you brought us back to inclusive design, and I think you've actually taken us on a bit of a journey in terms of particularly around the data, around the investment, around, there seems to be somewhat of some conflict and interest relative to how effectively one implement the smart city, because again, it goes back to earlier of the cognitive dissonance that Keisha was referring to, and who is at the control, or who is leading that, or what does cognitive dissonance look like in terms of who's orchestrating it. And it's a big picture, because again, we're talking about, again, a disparity of representation to build the confidence and the trust to say this tool or this mindset or paradigm is going to guide us. And we recognize that the current frame of that type of smart city or trust hasn't really inframed us. We have not been part of that picture within that frame because we haven't been deemed profitable. And that's where, again, we're looking at where is the investment. And it goes at, can we rely on industry to determine our fate? And I would probably say no, but that's government. And as was being said earlier, where the investiture, and it goes back to a bit what June was talking about policy. And again, I go back to the old school architecture to say, one thing I love about architecture in terms of the cognizance that the architect must maintain is they're constantly aware of all of the elements that impact their profession. And so to get it to the point where architecture is not applied as an icing on a cake or a kind of surface finishing. You were talking about the surface surveillance, and we're talking about maybe the sufas, what's underneath, what's at the base, what's at the root of it. And so we begin to look at, I've been making some notes about, because I think your topic, the urban future in investment, it's about investment and will industry make that investment? Will industries make a conscientious investment from the Facebooks or the Googles? Will they in turn realize that they've got an insurmountable amount of profit, and can they share that? Can they invest in that? Can that be a technological reparation that be utilized to, correct? Because again, as Valerie pointed out, the system is broke. And how do we rebuild it? And I go back to that saying, and I'm going to give you a quick case study. I had the opportunity to go to South Africa in right after apartheid became dismantled, if you will, as a system, as a failed system, as a corrupt system, as a fallacy. And, some of the people that really embraced the dismantling of apartheid were the white people, because they realized all these years they had been living under this fallacy, and it relieved them of that burden of saying, I am superior. But it didn't eliminate or take away their privilege. Their privilege was there. In fact, was still part of the structure. And so many Blacks thought, well, now they called it the gravy train, and they were going to now come in for this opportunity of a system that's been dismantled or broken. However, what they were replacing or ended up being the gatekeeper of was a broken system, because many blacks now were on the other side of the gate, or the other side of the fence, or the barrier. The barrier still was there. It was just a physical barrier, but now there was a structural barrier that was still there, an institutional barrier that was still there by privilege and by economy of scale and by the higher society, the 10% that benefited from that. So what I'm getting at is that all of the people who are disenfranchised by apartheid, and it still relates to the domestic challenge that many of us experience in the BIPOC communities, in the low income communities, and the disabled communities, because they were never part of the picture. They were never part of the smartness in terms of building up, of improving on what was already established. So in other words, in order for apartheid, for them to deal with the masses of townships were never meant to work. They were sort of, off the track, off the system. They were never meant to be regulated or monitored, just controlled, just in terms of barrier. So again, we're looking at how does the smart city look at the opportunities that have been neglected and say, is there an opportunity to invest in these communities, and who's leading that investment? What's the incentive, both economically and technologically, for incentives or investments to be made? And does the government lead that charge? Because the government clearly makes investments in weapons of mass destruction, clearly makes investments in Mars and space exploration, but where is that investment in terms of the elevation or even the building, using this opportunity, as Valerie said, of a broken system? Here's an opportunity where we can start making technological and economical reparations that people can invest in and build upon.
I'd like to challenge the term smart cities.
Go ahead, Judy, please.
You know, because there's also this term Black engineering, meaning you have stuff, you got to figure it out. We create our solutions from the quagmire that we're living in. And I actually take great hope from the increase in interest in cooperative development. There is a group in Oakland, EB-PREC. They are a nonprofit cooperative. No, actually, they are a for-profit cooperative development. And this hybrid for me is intriguing. One, because I used to be an economist. But this idea that this group was going to be a membership-based development group, they pay dividends to their members, and their sole purpose is to create a pool of housing options and commercial development opportunities that reside with their members. And their members are, of course, predominantly Black, Indigenous, people of color. And I find their rise to be interesting because it was started by an anthropologist and a lawyer, both African American. What I find particularly interesting is how much of the Oakland and Berkeley population galvanized around this idea of cooperative development. And then what I'm also finding intriguing is how many funds and grant opportunities have been brought to them to implement this rather revolutionary, but actually very old idea of cooperative ownership and development. And I find that to be actually smart, because they took a look at systems that didn't work, took a look at, okay, how do we expand ownership in the investment model? And it's like dividends. That's public shares. You sell shares. That's not new. But what they spun it with was, and they didn't try to say we're a sustainable developer. That's embedded in the mission. They were clearly focused on stabilizing people of color and Black and Indigenous. And they said that from day one. They have been very transparent about their mission. And what has been really fascinating to watch is how much of the population wrapped their arms around it. Half the individuals didn't really understand the mission, but that actually didn't matter. You gather enough people around the mission, you can actually implement some of your ideas. You're going to hit some barriers along the way, but they're showing proof of concept that this thing works. What also was launched at almost the same time was the publicly owned solar grid initiative. Again, taking utility that you pay PG&E, Oakland, and saying we want to control our power supply, we want to control our monthly expenses, and they galvanized around owning their own solar grid. Are they electrical engineers? I have no idea. But they came around the issue that they needed to solve for, which is they wanted independence and they were going for it and they figured it out. So I am less reliant on the Googles as a solution or a Facebook of the world as the basis for the solution, because we also have to admit that Google didn't invent anything. Everything that they have made actually came from DARPA, which is what we fund as a public. Everything they have spun out started with DARPA, which is a federal agency parallel to NASA. So the ideas that they have spun out to the public started as a nucleus elsewhere. And I actually take great courage from what's going on at the ground level that's indicating a pathway forward. Now, will we need government support for it to become nationwide? Absolutely, because there's going to be private interest which will start to squash this public initiative. So we need governance to step in at some point to push it, just like we needed government to step in when we needed housing after World War II. We wouldn't have had as many houses built without government support. So at some point, government needs to step behind and support the public issue.
I want to take just to answer, respond to a couple of Q&As here, because we have about a little less than 10 minutes to conclude. And some of these questions are short, and it's just maybe points that we could probably try to use to wrap up or close out. But one thing following your statement now, June, Jenny has shared with us, we have such a habit in this country to put development and control in things like smart cities, tech, in the hands of big tech. So, you know, I think that's something that you had addressed. How do we take this back? Was her comment. And then there's another comment from Camilo that says, what is one universal design implementation strategy that you think is critical in the building environment, which is not a technical requirement per building codes, i.e. ADA and ICC standards? So these are, you know, one comment on the tech and one comment on strategies and implementation of building environment requirements. Any thoughts on any of those comments? Maybe this is, again, something June. I know, Brad, I'm not sure if you have any further comments, since we're going to probably take it from the top, from Brad to June to Nikeisha and Nigel. And certainly Valerie, as our host, wonderful host, we certainly would like to include you in any of these sort of closing thoughts, or even kind of summary of many of the collective sides of the frame that we've addressed here today, from going back with urban environment, investment in services, to communication, to the practice in built environment, and back to education. Because again, I do want to point out in a couple of questions that I may share that any of you may care to touch on, is again, how do we begin to establish inclusive design as the new normal, the new paradigm or platform that is more inclusive and proactive to the most vulnerable BIPOC, low-income communities in our domestic built environment. Another question was, how might designers, because one thing I wanted to point out, and that's why I was glad to hear Nigel come back to the question of designers and inclusive design, after kind of bringing us through the smart city and all those people who are behind it and investing in it and leading it from a technological point of view, remembering that designers only can do so much. And that's what made me go back to June, because architects realize they have to work with the city, they have to work with the government, they have to work with policy, they have to work with developers. They understand all the players and all the stakeholders, and they're looking to be part of that process. They want to be in the room when that's happening, not kind of outside the room, just laying trim on the edges. And so again, how do designers kind of become empowered? As an educator, I go back to the value of PhDs, because again, if not, designers aren't going to be really establishing policy, establishing guidelines, and establishing the framework that industry and government can follow, or at least look at as incentives for change. So we have to really empower designers from the Brad perspective of university and education. We need to invest in greater aspects of knowledge and practice and study. And then the last point I want to say is, when and where should inclusive design mentoring be implemented in education and the future of greater representation in design practice and impact in our society? And I'm going to leave it at that, and I'll leave it for an open opportunity for anybody in the last 3 minutes, if you will, to touch on any of those points. I first want to go back to Valerie real quick. Valerie, do you have any closing thoughts you'd like to take us with before we try to have some final thoughts from our panelists?
I do. I would just like to suggest that one of the core ideas that we need to leave this with is to really get people to take seriously, who do you design for? And we think about people at the margins, think about people at the edge of the spectrum. We need to know who we're talking about. I can't tell you how many designers I've met who think that issues of functional limitation are about people who use wheelchairs. That is certainly an important population. It's tiny. We're talking about 26% of the adult population in the United States have some level of functional limitation. And difficulty walking and climbing stairs is enormous. It's 10 times the number of people who are the focus of our standards and codes on accessibility. So we're not even thinking about that. We need to learn from those people. And the number 2 reason is our brains, and brains that don't work in a typical way. And we as designers have to recognize that is a vast creative opportunity. There is almost nothing out there in terms of real guidance about how to do that. And we've got to learn from the people who live that experience. But it is a big, big, compelling and exciting design opportunity for creativity. And I just want to, that is so important that we understand who are we talking about. And you look at the deaths from COVID-19, over 150,000 Americans, and who are they typically? They are people with pre-existing conditions. Guys, we're talking about pre-existing conditions. That is the nature of what we're talking about. People who are carrying forward for more and more years of their lives chronic health conditions. So I just want to, it's really important that we unpack these things and recognize that we're not talking about people who are wearing a beanie saying, I'm a person with a disability. We're talking about the human condition. And lastly, I just want to say, however we can continue the conversation in terms of sharing examples. I mean, I've learned a lot from each of you today about things you know about that look promising, or things you were involved in. I mean, I think I'm going to turn to Nigel and get a buttons or t-shirts made. You know, the wisdom of others is not neutral. You know, the power base is not neutral. And I think we have to really think about that. But I also want to leave you with a thanks, but also a sense of optimism. We have never had a better opportunity, and we have to seize it. Thanks.
So Valerie, thank you very much for providing us the opportunity of hosting us, to bringing us and allowing us to serve our various perspectives on how we can better consume and digest the needs that we really need to help, hopefully give us the nutrition and the energy to that step forward.
This whole series is in memory of one of our former most wonderful staff, Eliza, Forrest, Kaye, Bromfield, who died very suddenly at 30, just a couple of years ago, and her family is supporting this effort. But really important to just remember, we are interconnected, and we have to see that as a value, not as a deficit. This is, autonomy is not the greatest good. Talk about ideas that need to be questioned. Interdependence is what we've learned.